Hello and welcome again. It's David and Brent. Today's Friday, February the 7th. A lot of things going on here. Thank you for joining us. We're going to share a few of our thoughts that we've been thinking about. The first one I want to point out is we have a new article on the Forecast Network looking at weather. It's a great summary and then the transcripts of the interviews with two different weather experts, meteorologists who are tracking the weather. As we start thinking about the planting season for 2020, the weather's going to be on everyone's mind. Of course, last year was the wet, late planting, and it's been wet. It's been cool here. In Indiana, we haven't had hardly any snow, but we've had a lot of rain, a lot of wetness across the Great Plains as well. So it's a great story to look at. One of the big takeaways there at the top of the summary was that we really have to watch the next 3 months of weather. That'll really set the stage for the planting season. So it seems like it's getting close, but we're still, that 3-month window away. One of the things that I also captured from the story was a year ago, they were looking at similar conditions, and they were really watching how much water's in the soil, how much water's in the rivers. And so I guess the starting point for 2020 looks a bit questionable for planting, but it's the next 3 months that really make the big difference as it plays out. So Brent, you're also thinking about 2020. It's the first week of February. There's 4 weeks in February, and you think about crop insurance price discovery period. So what have you been watching? What have you been thinking about?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to believe, but we are 25% of the way through the crop insurance price discovery period. And if history would repeat itself, I guess, we have a pretty good indication of what those prices are going to be with 25% in already. And right now, today, before today's close, they stood at $3.91 on corn and $9.19 on soybeans. If you look at that, that is a ratio of about 2.33. Last year, corn was $4, so we're pretty close on corn. Beans were $9.54 last year, $9.19 this year. Kind of hard to believe that beans actually were better last year in the middle of a trade war than they are today, given that we have a phase one trade agreement in place. So last year that ratio is 2.38. It's going to be really important to watch that, I think, going forward. And I think if soybeans don't start gaining some steam here pretty soon, we could, it's going to weigh heavier for corn acres. So keep your eye on that. I think it's worth watching.
Yeah, you surprised you. You asked what the date was when we were getting ready for this. I said, it's the 7th. The price discovery just started, but there's 4 weeks of discovery here, and we're 5 days into the 20 days of discovery. It's going to move quickly, and as you mentioned, prices are lower than they were a year ago. They're lower than they were a month ago for soybeans, and so it's hard to get an exciting story put together for soybeans at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. The other big thing going on right now, I think, in global markets is the coronavirus in China. And that is, there's just so much uncertainty around what is actually happening over there. I mean, you look at the magnitude of the quarantine program going on in China, and it's kind of mind-blowing. Nobody, there's a lot of dispute over as to whether the statistics that we're seeing on the disease are accurate. The Chinese have been saying that it has about a 2% mortality rate. They've been pretty consistent in that. And I think as long as that holds out to be true, it will be probably less catastrophic than something if that mortality rate starts to climb much above 2%. So it is just really hard to kind of get your head around. And what surprises me is kind of the overall lack of coverage of that in the United States. I mean, you turn on the TV news, I just don't see many stories about it. I think this is a really big deal.
And Brent, help me with this. The mortality rate, that's 2% of people who are infected with the disease.
Yeah.
are passing away. So there's a couple key metrics to keep in mind. How, what percentage of the population gets infected, or what's your likelihood of getting contracting the disease, and the next step is what's the mortality rate after that. And so, as you mentioned, the 2% isn't on the surface isn't as scary as some of the historic epidemic or pandemic diseases, but I think there's a lot of questions out there as to what the actual number is, and it takes a while for these numbers to start to get larger. One of the things I was looking at earlier, 31,000 cases worldwide confirmed at this point. And so that number's sort of been a rocket ship. We weren't really even talking about the disease 2.5 weeks ago. 2.5 weeks ago is when China, I think the 21st is when China started their quarantines of the large cities. And so the pace of this is going to continue to increase at what seems like an exponential trajectory. So Brent, I got a question for you. I haven't prepped you for this. What kind of time frame are we looking at? Is this something that we get some resolution with in a month, in 3 months, in 6 months? I guess, how do you think about this?
I don't know. I mean, the stuff I've read, I can only go off of what I've read. I think it's probably longer than a month. And the biggest question I think is going to be how severe the outbreak gets outside of China. It's already bad in China. If it gets into some other countries that have not good medical situations, I think it could be a lot more devastating. But I mean, just one sign of it, you look at just look at the New York Times has been covering this, and you start looking around at the traffic in Beijing, which is not even a major place, not under quarantine. Significant slowdown in activity there. So I think it's gonna scare a lot of people. Just for a point of reference, SARS had a mortality rate of about 10%, much higher than 2%, but it was not nearly as infectious. I mean, we've already blown by the total number of people who are infected with SARS. MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, has a mortality rate almost 1 in 3, which is really, really high, but fortunately not very many people get. It must be much harder to infect other people. So the transmission rate on this virus seems to be very high, but the mortality rate is closer to the flu than any of the other ones. At least that's what we think. The thing I'm going to watch in this, I mean, you've got this cruise ship that's quarantined in Japan, and we kind of know how many people are on it. It's going to be interesting to see what ultimately happens with those unfortunate people that are stuck on that ship. I think that will tell us maybe more about the mortality as well as how infectious it is.
In taking about this to agriculture and the broader economy, Larry Kudlow, of course, this week, economic advisor to the White House, made comments saying, well, yeah, this will have an impact on China's economy, and it will have an impact on China's ability to meet those phase one trade agreements. And so we signed phase one a couple weeks ago, and now we're already thinking about the implications of how we were talking about, will China be able to meet its agreements 3 or 4 weeks ago based on history and sort of this long run optimistic story. But now we're thinking about this global economic slowdown, the China economy slowing down as well, and the White House already acknowledging that the potential for that.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting to go back and see what happened to the ag trade during SARS. But we've got to remember that at that time, China was not nearly as big of a importer of agricultural goods. So, I think it could provide us with some information. I don't know how much, but something to look at.
So a couple more points that I have to share. USDA came out with this net farm income estimates for 2020 early this week. We're going to write a post over the weekend. It'll be available on Monday on the aei.ag site. The top line number isn't much different than the 2019 estimate. It's up about $1 billion or about 1%. But we sort of looked into the abyss a bit, and a lot of numbers under the surface. So a lot of increase in the value, the forecasted value of ag production, and a big drop off, as you would expect, in government payments without the MFP program for 2020 in the card. So take a look out for that. A lot of head scratching will go into that. I think it's early in the growing season, and you look at these numbers and you say, okay, do I think that we're going to see a big increase in the value of ag production this year? Yes, no, maybe a percentile, and you can move that, move forward with your expectations from that. One last story that I had to share, sort of a fun story. Groundhog's Day was Sunday. The groundhog, how accurate is Punxsutawney Phil? There's a fun article I shared. Turns out he's about 40% accurate. Someone's been tracking this data for 120 years, which means you'd be more accurate doing the opposite of what he says. The second thing that I found really interesting is, of course, people tracking the data. They found that a vast majority of the times, 103 times, he has seen his shadow, compared to 20 times when he has not. So next year, make a bet in the office. You should bet that he will see his shadow. That seems to be the most predictable thing that comes out of Punxsutawney Phil and his weather forecasts.
There you go. You can beat your friends that way.
All right. Well, that's all we have for this week. We're going to have some more content available next week, and we'll be back to share what we're thinking about. So thanks so much.
Thank you.